I wasn't in a good place that fall, and I knew it in the practical way a man knows a fence post is rotten long before he puts a hand on it and feels it give. I was 38, broad-shouldered, still strong from lifting calves and draft horse legs for half my life. And I had moved back into my late father's foothill homestead with 2 duffel bags, 3 locked-up toolboxes, and a clinic reputation I couldn't seem to outrun. The house sat at the edge of mixed timber and old meadow, paint peeling in long curls, porch sagging half an inch toward the creek, like it had gotten tired of holding itself up. I told people I came back to get the place in shape. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The part I never said cleanly was this. My hands still knew what to do, but my judgment didn't trust itself anymore. Last winter, on an emergency call out by Cinder Flats, I had walked into a barn with a panicked owner, a labouring mare, sleet knocking the roof like thrown gravel, and a blood pressure cuff that kept slipping because my gloves were wet. I had one window to act. I hesitated. Not long, maybe seconds, but long enough to matter. The mare didn't make it. The owner didn't yell, which somehow made it worse. He just stood there with both hands on the stall gate and said, "I thought you'd know." 2 weeks later, a clipped video of me in the clinic parking lot, blank-faced and silent while a client shouted, was making rounds on local phones. That was the public part. The private part was waking up every morning with the same sentence in my chest. Useful hands, broken instincts. My father had died 18 months before, sudden heart failure while checking a north fence in early snow. He left me the property because I was the only one who might still use it, which was his polite way of saying my sister had too much sense to sink money into old land and old grief. His barn smelled the same when I came back. Linseed oil, mouse droppings, old hay dust and leather gone dry. And that sameness did not comfort me the way people said it would. It felt like being measured against a man who could set a shoulder by lantern light, then sit down with black coffee and tell you exactly why your creek ran muddy in March. Dad had never called himself kind. He just did kind things and got back to work. I missed him in a way that made me quieter. Most days I lived by lists because lists don't ask how you're doing. Morning stove, feed blue, check south fence line, clear deadfall from the old access road. Pull camera cards from the trail cams I had started using mostly to count what still moved through the place. Mule deer, fox, occasional elk cow. One irritated raccoon that seemed to resent being photographed. I'd sit at the kitchen table with coffee gone bitter and scroll through thousands of ordinary frames. Ear flick, hoof lift, rain blur. Empty darkness between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., where only wind had passed. Normal, measurable, boring in the best possible way. I needed boring. Boring was proof the world still followed rules. By the second week of September, I had replaced 37 cedar posts and mended enough wire to keep my shoulders sore through the night. I slept in my old room because Dad's bedroom still looked occupied, like he might come in and ask why the feed bill was on the dresser instead of the office desk. At dawn, I walked with Blue up to the ridge above Alder Creek. He was an old cattle dog with one cloudy eye and a gait that had grown careful, but his ears still came up whenever I spoke his name. He watched me the way good dogs watch men they've known through too many versions of themselves. If I stood too long looking at nothing, he pressed his shoulder against my leg and sighed like a disappointed foreman. Ben had stopped asking to come out. That sentence hurt more than the horse, if I'm honest, because it happened slow and polite and looked like maturity from the outside. My son was 12, sharp as a tack, good at building things from scrap wood and asking questions I couldn't fake my way through. After the clinic mess, after the video, after I moved to the homestead temporarily, he started saying he had homework on weekends, then soccer, then a friend's birthday. My ex, Mara, didn't push him. She didn't push me either. She stuck to logistics in texts and short calls, and I couldn't blame her. We had spent years trying to keep my hours from swallowing the house. In the end, work and silence won by points. One Thursday evening, I called while standing at the kitchen sink with dishwater gone cold around my wrists. Mara answered on the second ring. "Hey," she said. "Everything okay?" Yeah, fine. I was wondering if Ben wanted to come up Saturday. I fixed the old bike trail behind the lower pasture." She paused long enough for me to hear a cabinet close in her kitchen. "He's got a science project due Monday." "I can help with that. I did pass 8th grade science once, contrary to rumours." She gave me a small laugh. "I'll ask him." A muffled exchange followed, his voice too far from the phone to catch words, then her voice again, softer. "He says maybe next weekend." "Okay. Cody." "Yeah. He still loves you. He doesn't know which version of you he's getting right now." I pressed my thumb hard into a crack in the enamel sink. Fair. When I hung up, Blue was sitting in the doorway watching me with that steady, unimpressed expression that said I had once again complicated a simple thing. I told him, "If you start giving parenting advice, I'm charging you rent." He thumped his tail once and went back to sleep, which was probably wise because my track record with mammals had been mixed lately. County Clinic called twice that month. First was the office manager asking whether I wanted to pick up my remaining books and framed licenses from the back room. Second was a younger vet, Darren, asking if I would consult on a draft team with recurrent colic because you always caught the subtle stuff. I stood in the barn aisle staring at a halter hook while he talked and could feel my throat close. Not from emotion exactly, more like my body had turned into a narrow gate. I told him to call the university extension line. Better resources, more current protocols. He thanked me and said he hoped I was doing all right. I said, "I'm keeping busy." It was true in the narrowest legal sense. Rain came early that year, a cold, thin rain that never quite committed to a storm, but never left either. The foothills stayed slick, and the meadows held standing water in low pockets where sedge leaned flat and gold. I kept a notebook in my jacket and logged practical things. Mineral block down by 20%, evidence of coyote near east pasture, one section of roof flashing loose above feed room. I did not log the less practical things, like how often I stood in the barn doorway at dusk and listened to nothing, or how my pulse jumped whenever a horse trailer rumbled on the county road, even though no trailer was turning into my drive. On a Monday near the end of the month, I drove into town for diesel and parts, parked farther than necessary, and spent 10 minutes in the hardware aisle pretending to compare drill bits so I wouldn't have to talk to anyone who might ask when I was coming back to work. Roy McCall, my nearest neighbour, caught me anyway by the feed counter. Roy had the kind of face weather carves out of a man over 60 years, and no use for soft phrasing. "You look less haunted," he said, not as a compliment, just data. "Hi, bar," he grunted. "Fence holding?" "Mostly." "Boy been up lately?" "Not lately." Roy shifted a 50-pound salt bag like it was a grocery sack. "Keep asking. Don't make the kid do all the crossing." I nodded because he was right, and because men like Roy can offer mercy without dressing it up as therapy. Then he asked if I could look at a limp in one of his heifers. Just with your eyes, no paperwork. And I said yes before fear could get involved. We set it for Wednesday. My chest tightened after I agreed, but underneath that was a thread of something I hadn't felt in a while. Not confidence exactly. Maybe willingness. 3 days later, I was in Roy's lot at first light, boots sinking in wet clay, watching a red heifer favour her left rear in small, stubborn arcs. I stayed outside the rail first, breathing slow, narrating to myself what I could see. weight-bearing present, hoof wall intact, likely soft tissue strain above hock. Roy waited beside me, hat brim dripping. "You gonna touch her?" he asked. "In a minute." I stepped in when I was ready, one hand on the rail until my body remembered the old sequence. Approach from shoulder. Let her clock your position. Palm on flank. Pressure. Release. She flinched once, then settled. I worked through the leg methodically, talking low without thinking, the way I had with nervous horses and scared owners for years. No drama, no freeze. When I stepped back, I realized I had been holding my breath less and listening more. Roy handed me a rag. "Well," he said, "strain, not break. Rest. Anti-inflammatory. Dry footing if you can manage it in this weather." He nodded. "You still got it." I almost corrected him. Didn't. The sentence sat in the damp morning between us like a tool I wasn't ready to pick up, but I didn't throw it away either. By early October, the maples along Alder Creek had gone rust red and then mostly bare, and the mornings carried that iron smell that means frost is near, even when the ground stays mud. Ben texted me a photo of a bridge he built for school out of popsicle sticks and glue, load-bearing test written in thick marker on the poster board. I wrote back, "Solid truss work, proud of you." He sent a thumbs up, and 5 minutes later, "You still got that old field microscope?" I stared at that message for a long time before answering. "Yeah, come get it Saturday if you want." He replied, "Maybe." Saturday came with low clouds and sleet tapping the porch roof. I set the microscope on the table anyway, and made chili I knew was too spicy for him, then watered it down with canned tomatoes, and pretended that was the plan all along. He didn't come. Mara texted at noon. He woke up with a sore throat. "Rain check." I told her no problem and meant it only partly. Blue ate a spoonful of cooled chili off a saucer like he was doing me a favor. The next morning, the crows started up before daylight. Not their usual scattered racket, but a concentrated calling from the meadow edge beyond the old irrigation ditch. I heard them while I was pulling on my boots, and stood still long enough to count rhythm. 3 bursts, pause. 3 bursts, pause. Blue lifted his head from his bed by the stove and looked at me, ears tipped forward. I grabbed my field bag from the hook without deciding to, checked that it held gauze, tape, splint wrap, saline, and the small bottle of sedative I carried for injured livestock, then shrugged into my waxed jacket. Outside, sleet hissed through fir needles and the air smelled like wet bark and cold earth. The crows called again, insistent now, and I followed the sound down towards the meadow. The ditch bank was slick enough that I sidestepped most of it, one hand on alder trunks, boots filling at the cuffs while sleet worked down my collar in thin, cold threads. Blue moved ahead and then circled back twice. Not anxious, just checking that I was still coming, the way he used to do when Ben was little, and insisted on carrying his own fishing rod through brush taller than he was. The crows kept at it until I reached the break in the willows, then the calls cut off all at once, like somebody closed a door on them. That sudden quiet did more to my pulse than the noise had. I stood there listening for wing beats, for chittering jays, for the creak and wind and all the ordinary clutter of a foothill morning. I got creak and wind. Nothing else. I went down into the meadow slowly, every step placed where I could see mud instead of hidden roots. Ferns had browned at the edges from early frost, and cattails along the ditch leaned in wet clumps, heads blown out and ragged. The whole place looked bruised by weather, grey and green and the colour of old pennies. Blue stopped 20 feet in front of me and looked back over his shoulder. He wasn't stiff. No raised hackles, no warning growl, no "that ain't right" bark he gave for coyotes near the feed shed. His tail stayed low, and it wagged once, careful and almost polite. Then he sat down facing the tree line to the west, as if he had reached the edge of somebody else's porch. "Easy, old man," I said, though my voice came out dry and thin. I kept scanning for what had drawn the crows. Predation was the practical answer. That was what crows did this time of year. They found what failed in the night and advertised it to anyone listening. I expected scattered hair, a torn hide, drag marks cutting through sedge. Instead, I found a doe lying in fern litter just beyond the willow brake, head up, eyes open, breathing slow enough to count each rise and fall. She looked at me without trying to stand. That was wrong, in a different way. I crouched 3 steps away and let her scent me. Wet deer coat, crushed fern, a sour edge of stress sweat, and beneath it, the clean tannin smell of fresh bark. Her left foreleg was stretched forward, and for 1 second my brain refused to sort what I was seeing because the arrangement belonged in a teaching diagram, not in this meadow. 2 split lengths of pale bark sat on either side of her cannon bone. Slender willow rods reinforced the outer line. The whole thing was bound with braided grass in even wraps from below the knee to above the fetlock. Pressure distributed, joints spared, not too tight. Whoever did it had aligned the leg before securing it. Whoever did it understood circulation and swelling. I set my field bag down in the mud and swallowed hard enough. It hurt. My first thought was insultingly simple. Prank. Somebody messing with me because people in small counties get bored and because my name had made easy conversation for months. My second thought was poacher camped somewhere up creek, maybe with wilderness medic training, maybe with too much time. My third thought was I had finally worked my own nerves into a bad movie. I told myself this couldn't be real in any way that made sense, then immediately started checking capillary refill at the hoof because training will keep moving even when belief stalls out. The hoof was cool, but not cold. Digital pulse present. She flinched when I palpated higher, and the fracture line was there under the splint, ugly and swollen but stabilized cleanly enough that bone ends weren't grinding. The grass ties had been wetted before cinching, then allowed to shrink and set. I could feel the tension, snug and elastic, not tourniquet tight. There were no synthetic fibers, no tape residue, no knife cuts in the bark. The willow had been peeled by hand, long strips lifted without tearing the cambium. I could have taught a first-year student from that work. "Who did this to you?" I heard myself ask her, quiet as if I were in a stall with a skittish colt. She blinked once, slow. Blue stayed where he was, sitting and watching the trees. The meadow held that same deep hush, not eerie exactly, more attentive than empty. Rain ticked on alder leaves. Creek water pushed against stones downstream with a muffled, steady shove. No alarm snorts from other deer. No scatter of wings. I realized I was breathing through my mouth and made myself stop. Drew in the cold through my nose and took inventory, because inventory is what keeps me useful. Sedate demeanor without drug odor, no puncture marks at neck or hind quarter, body condition fair, mild dehydration, probable overnight immobilization. Then one detail pulled at my eye. Under her shoulder and chest, someone had layered fresh cedar boughs over flattened grass, so she wasn't grinding herself raw against damp ground. Not random brush tossed under her. A bed, adjusted by hand. I sat back on my heels and put both palms on my thighs to steady them. The last months had given me plenty of chances to doubt myself, and I had taken most of them. I had replayed one bad hesitation until it became a verdict on my whole life. Out here with sleet tapping my hood and a deer watching me like she'd already decided I was either help or nothing, there was no room for that courtroom. Either I did the next right thing or I didn't. The old fear came up anyway, sharp and familiar. What if I touched this and made it worse? What if I missed one detail and lost her because my timing was off again? What if useful hands and broken instincts was permanent, and this was just another test? I was built to fail. Blue huffed once, still facing the trees, and then turned his head toward me. That one cloudy eye and one clear eye found me with the same plain expectation he gave me every morning. Work now. Feel later. Yeah, I said to him. I hear you. I drew up ketamine in case I needed to reset the splint, but when I tested each tie and alignment point, I left most of it in the syringe. There was bruising along the medial side, but whoever had set the leg had done it early, before swelling locked it wrong. I slipped a folded gauze pad under one grass band where chafe was starting, checked airway and gum color again, and mixed oral electrolyte in a collapsible bowl. She took 2 cautious mouthfuls. Blue finally stood and came closer, sniffed her flank, then looked back to the same stand of lodgepole pines, and sat again. His tail hung easy, the tip making a single slow sweep. I followed his gaze and saw nothing except trunks, rain mist, and a narrow seam of darker shade where the ground rose. Still, the skin between my shoulders prickled with the plain fact of being observed, not hunted, watched. There's a difference, and I knew it the way I knew tendon from ligament by touch. My chest tightened, then eased for reasons I couldn't defend. I needed to move her before temperature dropped again. The old calf sled was stashed near the south fence, maybe a quarter-mile off, and I could rig it with tarp and hay. Leaving her alone risked shock if she panicked when I returned. Staying put risked losing daylight and getting both of us stuck in freezing rain. I compromised. I looped a light line from her neck to a willow stem so she'd feel resistance and not lunge, tucked more cedar under her shoulder from the pile already there, and set my jacket over her hindquarters for heat. She watched all of it with that same heavy-lidded calm, like the world had handed her one more strange man and she'd decided to grade me later. Back in 10, I told her. 15 if my knees argue. Blue rose before I did and took 2 steps toward the trees, then came back to my side as if he had checked in with someone out of sight and gotten permission to escort the fool human to his own equipment. I laughed once, short and surprised, because the idea was ridiculous and because my nerves needed somewhere to go. If you start filing reports, I'm done, I told him. He gave me no opinion and trotted ahead through sedge. By the time I hauled the sled back, sleet had shifted to a cold rain that soaked straight through denim. My shoulders burned. The doe was where I'd left her, and my jacket was still over her hips. But one thing had changed. Beside her foreleg on the fern mat lay 3 stems of yarrow with the roots trimmed clean, and the flower heads intact despite the weather. Fresh cut, no mud on the stalks. I stared at them long enough rain pooled on my lower lashes. Yarrow was an astringent. Old-timers used it for minor bleeding and poultices. I had a dried jar of it in my kitchen from my father's shelves. I had not gathered any this year. I looked up so fast my neck popped. Trees, mist, nothing moving. Okay, I said, too loud in the hush. I don't know what game this is. No answer came, and I hadn't expected one, but Blue walked to the yarrow, sniffed, and then sat down beside it like it belonged there. He didn't look spooked. He looked patient. I was the one acting jumpy. I slid my hands under the doe's neck and brisket and counted out loud before each shift, keeping her limbs stable against my forearm while I inched her onto the tarp-lined sled. She grunted once, and then settled. No thrashing, no wild-eyed fight. Just compliance that made me feel less like a rescuer than a stand-in arriving late to work someone else had already started. I secured her with 2 broad straps, checked the splint again, and tucked the yarrow stems into my bag without knowing why. Evidence, maybe. Maybe gratitude in a form I could carry. When I finally noticed the tracks, I was bracing the sled handles and preparing for the uphill drag. The mud around the fern patch was churned with rain dimples and my own boot marks. But beyond that, where the ground held softer clay under fur drip, impressions stood deep and clear. Not hoof, not boot, not bare. 5 forward points, broad heel, arch shallow but there, each print almost the length of my forearm from wrist to fingertip. I set my gloved hand beside one and had room left over. 18 inches, give or take, pressed down hard enough to displace water, but spaced in a measured line that curved around the doe's resting spot without stepping close to her ribcage, as if the maker had known exactly where not to crowd an injured animal. Rain ran through one print and made a tiny stream over the toe ridge. I crouched until my knees complained and traced the edge in the air without touching. My mind offered every explanation it could manufacture. Thaw distortion, overlapping tracks, carved prank feet strapped to boots. Each one fell apart on contact with the actual ground. The depth varied with soil softness in a way fake impressions rarely do. The stride shortened near the deer and lengthened toward the tree line. One print at the edge had a faint drag mark where something heavy had been carried and set down. Cedar boughs, maybe. Maybe more. Blue walked to the nearest track, placed one paw just outside the heel, and looked toward the lodgepoles again. His tail hovered near his hocks and gave one deliberate flick. Then he sat. I stood there with rain in my eyes, one hand on the sled handle, and felt a crack open in the hard shell I'd been living inside since last winter. Not belief, not yet, but curiosity with teeth, and underneath that a small, stubborn warmth I hadn't trusted in months. Whatever had moved through this meadow last night had done careful work and left room for me to continue it. That was the part I could not argue with. I set my boots for the climb, leaned into the weight, and started pulling the doe toward the homestead while Blue paced at my knee and the quiet trees watched us go. I leaned forward into the drag straps until my thighs shook, and the sled runners hissed through wet grass while rain tapped the tarp over the doe like fingers on a drum skin. Every 10 steps I stopped to check her breathing and the lashings, not because they had slipped, but because checking gave my mind a job. The old sentence that had lived in my chest for months kept trying to push in, useful hands, broken instincts, and each time it did, I answered with measurements instead. Respiratory rate low but steady, ear temperature cool, not dropping, splint still aligned. Blue ranged ahead, came back, ranged again, then settled near my left knee whenever the grade steepened, as if his weight could anchor me to the hill. By the time the homestead came into view through fir trunks, my shoulders had gone from pain to numb heat. I took her to the lambing pen behind the main barn, the one Dad had built with half walls and a south-facing lean-to to block crosswind. I bedded it deep with dry hay, slid old horse mats over the lowest boards so she wouldn't catch a hoof, and rigged a tarp break to keep sleet from blowing straight in. The whole while Blue sat in the doorway, not guarding me, not guarding her, just watching the west trees with a patient attention that made the back of my neck prickle and settle at the same time. Inside the pen, under lantern light and rain noise, I finally got to study the splint without mud and weather in my eyes. It was better than I'd realized in the meadow. The bark had been shaved smooth where it touched tendon. The willow rods were flexed to match contour, not forced flat. Grass braids crossed in figure-8 turns near the joint lines to prevent drift. Whoever had done it understood what movement does to a fracture over hours, not minutes. I trimmed one tie and replaced it with soft wrap where swelling had started, then set the trimmed braid on the feed room shelf instead of tossing it. I don't know why I kept it. Maybe because throwing it away felt like erasing a signature, When she was settled and nosed into soaked pellets, I stripped my jacket, wrung rainwater from the cuffs, and laid the 3 yarrow stems beside the sink under better light. They were fresh, cut clean. Across, no torn fibres, no bite marks from deer. I lined them on a paper towel like specimens and caught myself doing what I did in clinic workups, documenting. I took photos of the splint from 4 angles, the tracks from the meadow, the yarrow. Then I wrote time and location in my field notebook with hands that had finally stopped shaking. Curiosity did what shame hadn't managed. It moved me. That night I slept in clothes that smelled like wet cedar and woke twice certain I had heard hoof strikes, but each time the pen was quiet and the doe was still down, chewing slow and calm. At first light, I brewed coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in and carried a bucket to her. On the threshold, I stopped. Outside the pen, just beyond the reach of the overhang, 2 fist-sized creekstones sat crossed in an X on the packed dirt where there had been nothing at midnight. They were clean, recently handled clean. No clinging soil, no algae film. Blue came up behind me, sniffed once, and wagged the tip of his tail. I left the stones where they were and told myself it was because I needed to photograph them first. That was only partly true. The larger truth was, I had started treating the property like a conversation and had no idea how to answer yet. So I answered in the language I knew. I added broad-spectrum antibiotic to the doe's mash, checked distal pulse, refreshed bedding, and hung a tarp flap to cut draft. Then I walked to the water trough by the lower pasture and left a second feed pan with mineral mix where deer crossed the fence gap. I said out loud, feeling foolish and steady at once, "If this is your patient too, she needs calories and quiet." Blue watched me like I had started saying grace over fence posts. By Tuesday morning, the rain had thinned to mist, and the first skim of frost silvered the wheelbarrow handles. I found another crossed stone mark near the trough, smaller this time, and 3 mud-smudged hoofprints from what looked like a yearling doe, stopping, feeding, and moving on. No torn ground, no panic scatter, just use. I made myself run rational checks anyway because that was still part of staying honest. Prankster activity unlikely given consistent timing and no vehicle tracks on the access road. Survivalist caretaker possible, but no synthetic cordage. No cut marks, no camp sign. Track distortion unlikely with repeated print morphology across varied substrate. I read those notes back and nearly laughed at myself. I was writing case reports for a mystery. By the end of that week, my mornings had shape again. Feed stove, check doe, inspect swelling, swap damp hay, clear trough ice, walk fence, review trail cam cards. The cards gave me plenty of ordinary proof. Fox, raccoon, mule deer, 1 very offended porcupine. And then a run of frames at 5:12 a.m. near the woodshed where wind-thrown logs had lain tangled for months. In the first frame they were scattered hardwood and pine mixed together. In the last frame, 9 minutes later, they were stacked in 2 neat columns by species, long ends aligned under the eave where they'd stay dry. No body in frame, no blur, no eyeshine, just the result. I stood at my kitchen table with coffee cooling in my hand and said, to no one, "Well, that saves me an hour." I did not feel mocked. That surprised me most. I felt accompanied. On Saturday, Roy pulled into my drive for the chain binder I'd borrowed in spring and found me in the shed, sorting that stacked wood into stove lengths. He watched a minute, then squinted at the rows. "You finally hired help?" "Not exactly." He set the binder on the bench and jerked his chin toward the barn. "Heard you're rehabbing a wild doe now. Mara told my sister at church you went full mountain hermit veterinarian." "She had a fracture. Somebody splinted it before I got there." "Somebody." "Yeah." Roy waited. He knew me too well to fill silence when I was circling something hard. I wiped my palms on my jeans. You ever seen tracks out West Meadow bigger than a dinner plate? He gave me a flat look. Bear can sink wide in thaw. Not bear. 5 toes forward, clear heel, long stride till it nears an injured animal, then shorter like it's picking steps. Splint was textbook, Roy. Better than textbook. His mouth twitched, not unkind. You saying a giant fixed a fracture? I'm saying somebody did, and they knew more than luck. He held my eyes for a long moment, then shrugged once. Well, whoever your somebody is, tell him I've got a gate he can hang. He walked back to his truck, paused with one hand on the door, and added, You sound like yourself again. Keep doing whatever this is. That line stayed with me through the afternoon while I cleaned an old snare off the north fence line. One rusted wire loop probably set years ago for coyotes, and forgotten. I disinfected it, tagged it for disposal, and left it on the porch rail to haul to county waste. At dusk, when I stepped out to shut the coop, a fresh spray of yarrow lay beside the tagged wire. Not dropped random, but placed with the stems aligned the way a careful hand lines up instruments. I actually looked over my shoulder and said, You're making this very hard to explain. Blue sneezed and sat down like he agreed. 3 days passed with clear mornings and brittle nights, and the doe began to stand for short stretches, testing weight with that cautious toe-touch animals use when pain is easing, but trust is still being negotiated. I adjusted her wrap, trimmed one hoof edge, and moved her to a slightly larger run so she could pivot without twisting the fracture line. Blue took to lying outside her gate in afternoon sun, one ear cocked toward the timber. The old dog had become my barometer. If he was easy, I stayed easy. The first full glimpse came on an evening that had no business changing me and did anyway. A break-in cloud opened over the western ridge, amber light pouring through mist, so the trunks looked lacquered gold on one side and blue-grey on the other. Blue trotted ahead of me up the game trail behind the lower pasture, then stopped at the crest and waited. I came up beside him, breathing hard from the climb, and followed his line of sight into a draw half-shadowed by lodgepole. At first I saw movement without shape, fern heads nodding in sequence where no wind reached, then the slow shift of something dark between trunks too narrow to hide it fully. It stepped once into the open, and the scale rearranged the whole hillside. Against the lodgepoles it stood easily 8 feet, maybe more, broad through shoulders and chest, fur dark brown with rain along the guard hairs catching that amber light in dull copper streaks. Its arms hung long, hands massive, fingers tapered and curved inward at rest. Nothing in its posture was rushed. Nothing was aimed at me. I went very still, not from fear, from the weight of finally seeing what all those signs had been pointing toward. My mind tried one last scramble for ordinary answers, and came up empty without panic. Blue sat, tail sweeping grass once, then twice. Downslope from the figure, a yearling buck had its hind leg cinched in old fence wire snagged around a blowdown branch. It wasn't thrashing, just tight with strain, neck stretched, eyes wide. The big figure angled toward it with a side-on approach I recognized from handling frightened horses. No direct crowding, no abrupt reach. It paused 3 feet away, lowered into a crouch that looked careful for something built that large, and set one hand on the log to steady weight before touching the wire with the other. Even at that distance I could see the precision. It lifted tension, rotated the loop, freed the hoof, then held still while the yearling stumbled clear. The buck hopped twice, looked back once, and bounded into brush. The figure stayed crouched another beat, then rose and stepped over a cluster of saplings rather than through them, placing each foot so the stems bent and sprang back instead of snapping. I had spent years watching heavy animals move under stress. This was deliberate restraint, not accident. I don't know what expression I had on my face then, but my cheeks were wet and it wasn't rain anymore. I heard myself whisper, "Thank you," though I couldn't have said whether I meant the deer, the doe, the woodpile, or the simple fact that I was watching. Strength chose gentleness with no audience needed. The figure turned its head slightly toward us. Distance and dusk softened detail, but I caught the eyes. Amber brown, steady, not hard. We held that line for 2 breaths, maybe 3. Then it stepped backward into timber 1 pace at a time, and the forest took its outline without drama. Blue stood, gave a small huff, and leaned against my shin like he did when storms rolled in. I put my hand on his neck and stayed there until the amber light drained off the ridge. On the walk back to the barn, I kept waiting for disbelief to flood in and erase what I'd seen. It never did. What came instead was quieter and sturdier. A trust in my own witnessing I hadn't felt since before that winter barn, before hesitation became identity. Whatever else the world held, I had seen kindness done with enormous hands, and my own hands did not feel broken in that moment. I kept my hand on Blue's neck all the way down the trail, and by the time the barn light came into view through the firs, my breathing had settled into something close to normal. The doe was on her sternum when I stepped into the pen, ears angled toward me, eyes clear. She took soaked pellets from my hand and flared her nostrils at my damp jacket like she was checking where I'd been. I worked through her leg in the same order as always, fingers reading heat and swelling through wrap layers, and found one new detail that stopped me mid-motion. The outer willow support I had planned to replace tomorrow had already been swapped for a cleaner, straighter branch, bark peeled smooth where it would rub. The tie pattern matched the earlier work. Figure 8s where drift mattered, broader bands where tissue needed room. I had not touched it since noon. I sat on the overturned bucket in the aisle and looked at that splint until the lantern hiss filled the silence. My mind still offered alternatives out of habit. Maybe I'd done it myself and forgotten in fatigue. Maybe Roy had stopped by and decided to play medic. Maybe there was somebody out there with field training and a taste for secrecy. The first theory died under memory. I could account for every hour of the day. The second died under style. Roy fixed with baling twine and language, not braided grass and gentle pressure points. The third kept some breathing room, but it didn't explain the tracks, or the stones, or the way Blue sat like he was waiting for a polite neighbor. I told myself this couldn't be real in any ordinary way. And then I watched the doe set her jaw, shift her weight, and rest easier in a splint that was better than mine had been yesterday. I fed Blue in the mudroom, wiped him down with an old towel, and stood for a long minute at the sink while the pump rattled cold water into a chipped basin. I wasn't trying to decide whether I believed anymore. That question had worn itself out. The better question was what I was supposed to do with a fact pattern that felt bigger than my categories and kinder than my fear. I dried my hands, took 2 apples from the crate, and cut them into quarters with Dad's pocket knife. Then I carried them to the stump by the west fence, halfway between the pen and the trees, and laid them out in a circle because that seemed less like bait and more like an offering. I felt ridiculous and entirely sincere. "Thank you for the leg," I said to the dark timber, and the wood, and the yarrow. Blue sat beside me and gave one thoughtful chuff. That night, sleep came in shallow pieces. At some hour when the stove had burned down to a red eye and rain had gone to mist, Blue lifted his head, but didn't bark. I pulled on boots and stepped onto the porch with a blanket around my shoulders. Moonlight had come through in torn patches, silvering the yard and turning the wet boards of the corrals pale as bone. The apple stump sat 30 yards out, bright, where the cut fruit caught light. At first I saw only shadow and fence lines. Then a shape detached from the tree edge and moved into the open with the same unhurried precision I'd seen on the ridge. He was closer than before, and scale changed everything again. The top rail of the west fence came to about mid-thigh on him. Fur lay dark and dense along his shoulders, longer over forearms, rain-beaded and shedding in tiny runs when he shifted. He did not square up to me. He angled his body, one shoulder forward, head slightly lowered, the way a calm stock horse offers less pressure to a nervous handler. He stopped at the stump, looked at the apples, then looked at me. Blue stayed loose at my side, tail low, not a hint of alarm in him. I stayed where I was, one hand on the porch post so I wouldn't do anything stupid with nerves. "You can have those," I said quietly, no strings attached. He reached down with 2 fingers and thumb, careful as if picking up a bird egg, and lifted one apple quarter. He brought it toward his face, not quite eating, almost smelling first, then set it back on the stump and turned his palm up in the moonlight. Something lay there pale against the dark of his skin. He stepped 3 paces closer to the fence, lowered his hand and placed the object on the top board, a strip of clean birch bark folded around fresh yarrow and a short length of willow cambium tied with grass, a field dressing bundle. Then he backed up to the stump again and waited. I remember thinking, plain as that, he isn't afraid of me either. That understanding hit me harder than the size, harder than the tracks. Fear had been my main language for months. Fear of making the wrong call, fear of freezing, fear of touching anything alive that needed steadiness from me. Standing there in moonlit mud, I watched a being who could have stayed hidden, choose to close distance in measured steps, and leave medicine on a fence rail like a neighbor returning a borrowed tool. Not dominance, not performance. Trust, offered in the simplest possible form. I picked up the birch bundle slowly so he could see my hands. "I got it," I said. "I see it." He dipped his head once. No rush, no drama. Then he turned, stepped over the lower fence brace without touching it, and moved back toward the trees. Halfway there, he paused and looked over his shoulder. His eyes caught moonlight, amber brown and steady. I raised my free hand, and he stood for one heartbeat more before the timber took him. Blue exhaled through his nose like he'd been holding a comment all night. I laughed under my breath, a rough little sound from someplace I hadn't used in a while. "Yeah," I told him. "I know, I saw it too." By the 3rd morning after that porch exchange, the ground had crusted hard at dawn and thawed slick by noon, and the whole property smelled of wet leaves and wood smoke. I'd settled into a rhythm that felt less like bracing and more like living. The doe stood longer each day. I refreshed her wraps, rotated pressure points, and logged appetite and stance in my notebook like the old me had never left. I set one trail cam to cover the pen gate and west approach, another on the shed corner. Not because I needed proof for town, but because I wanted to understand patterns well enough to do my part without getting in the way. If this was a conversation, I intended to answer clearly. Around mid-afternoon, clouds thickened over Alder Creek and a raw wind started coming down the draw. I was in the feed room measuring mash when Blue's bark cut through the barn, sharp twice and then silent. Not panic, but urgent enough that I dropped the scoop and ran. Outside, the doe had tried to pivot toward the lean-to wall and slipped a hind hoof through a gap between lower rails. She was half down, forequarters twisted, splinted leg pinned awkward against the panel. She thrashed once and froze, breathing fast, eyes wide with that bright, trapped look that can go bad in seconds. I went straight to her shoulder and got one hand on her neck to keep her from throwing weight. "Easy, girl," Easy, I got you. My voice sounded steady. My pulse was not. The panel pinning the splinted leg had swollen tight in damp weather, and when I grabbed it to lift, it held like it was nailed to the earth. I shifted grip, tried leverage with my knee, got half an inch, and no more. The old fear came up hot in my chest. Timing, decisions, consequences all at once. And for a flash, I felt that winter barn closing in around my ears. Useful hands, broken instincts. The sentence arrived on schedule, mean and familiar. Then I heard footfalls in the mud behind me, heavy but controlled, and Blue went quiet. I didn't turn right away. I kept one hand on the dough and said into the wind, "If you're here to help, I need this rail up and out, slow and steady." A shadow crossed the pen wall. He came to the outside of the panel and crouched, huge hands finding purchase at the post and top board. He looked at me first, waiting. I nodded once. He lifted. Wood rose as if it had lost weight, not jerked, not torn free, just raised smooth enough that I could slide my forearm under the splinted leg and guide it back into line. The dough kicked once against my hip, then settled when pressure released. "Hold," I said. He held. I pulled her hoof clear of the gap, tucked hay under her chest, and eased her weight onto a folded mat. "Down now, gentle." He lowered the panel in increments, leaving space where the gap had been worst. I grabbed a spare plank and wedged it as a temporary brace. He watched my hands, then reached to the ground beside him, picked up a straight length of deadfall I hadn't noticed, and set it upright against the weak post. Not random placement. Exactly where reinforcement belonged. He pressed the base into mud with his heel, tested the panel with 2 fingers, and released. The dough lay panting but stable. I checked her splint. Slight scuff on outer bark. No new heat spike, no displacement. I felt my knees go weak and sat back in wet hay for a second, one forearm across my face. Relief came through me so fast it almost hurt. "Thank you," I said, and this time my voice broke on it. He stayed where he was, outside the rail, giving space. Blue moved to him, sniffed his wrist, and then, like this was the most normal thing in the county, sat against the post at his feet. The big hand lowered and rested for one brief moment on Blue's shoulder, light enough to barely sink fur. Then it lifted away. I re-wrapped the scuffed section, added padding, and got the dough drinking in small pulls. When I stood, he had already stepped back from the pen. He glanced toward the shed, then walked there and returned carrying 2 peeled willow lengths and a forked branch from my own stack, set them by the weak panel, and waited again. I understood. Together, in a quiet choreography that felt practiced even though it had never happened before, we shored the pen. Him holding load, me setting braces and tying with rope, him testing each point with careful pressure so I could retie where it slipped. No wasted motion, no confusion about intent. When the last knot was snug, I straightened and found him watching me with those steady amber-brown eyes. Wind pushed cold through the yard. Somewhere down by the creek, a raven called once. "You just saved her leg," I said. "Maybe her life." He stood another breath, then reached to the fence rail and tapped the birch bundle I had tucked there this morning, now empty from use. A small gesture, almost a reminder. Keep going. He turned, crossed the yard in 5 long, quiet strides, and disappeared into the west timber without so much as a snapped twig. I leaned both hands on the repaired panel and laughed once, half exhausted and half amazed. Blue came back to my side and pressed against my knee, hard enough to rock me. That evening, after the dough settled and the wind dropped, I called Mara from the mudroom with hay in my hair and wrap tape stuck to my sleeve. She answered on speaker, and I could hear dishes in the background and Ben asking something about batteries. "Hey," I said. "I know it's a school night, so quick thing. If Ben still wants that microscope, I've got it cleaned and working. He can come Saturday, no pressure." A pause, then Mara said, "He's right here, ask him." I heard him closer to the phone. "Does it still have the little slide clips?" "Both of them, and I found your old field notebook, the one with frog drawings that look like potatoes." He snorted a laugh. "They were tadpoles." "Then I owe several potatoes an apology." Another pause, lighter this time. "I can come Saturday," he said, "if that's okay." I looked out the mudroom window toward the dark west fence where moonlight had started to silver the rails we'd just braced. "Yeah," I said, "that's more than okay." After we hung up, I went back out with a lantern to check the doe one last time. She lifted her head, blinked at me, and settled deeper into dry hay against a panel that held firm. On the top rail beside the knot I'd tied lay a single smooth creek stone crossed over a short twig, neat as a signature. I touched the rail with my fingertips and stood there in the cold, feeling wonder settle in me not as shock anymore, but as a workable kind of trust. I stood there a long while with my fingers on that cold rail, lantern light breathing against the boards and the crossed stone and twig, sitting neat beside my knot, like someone had signed off on work we'd done together. Blue leaned against my leg and sighed, and the doe shifted in her straw with a soft rustle that carried through the pen like paper turning. Nothing dramatic happened. No sudden movement. Just that quiet settling of animals and wood and wind after hard effort. It should have felt ordinary. Instead, it felt like my chest had a door on it that somebody had unlatched without asking. I picked up the stone and twig, carried them to the feed room shelf, and set them beside the trimmed grass braid and the yarrow stems I'd already dried between notebook pages. I told myself I was cataloguing, keeping a record the way any field vet would when facts got strange. The truth was simpler. I didn't want to lose any piece of this because every piece kept proving the same thing. Care had happened here, over and over, with intent. Inside the barn, the lantern threw warm circles across old tools and dust, and I went through the doe's checks one more time. Gum color pink, distal pulse present, splint stable. She nudged my sleeve when I bent near her shoulder, and I laid my hand against her neck and felt that steady deer heat under winter thickening coat. My throat tightened so fast it almost felt like swallowing a stone. I stayed crouched beside her until my knees started to burn, and then I sat down in the straw because there wasn't any point pretending I was still in command of this moment. "I was scared to touch anything that needed me," I said out loud, and the words sounded rough in the half-dark, like they had sat too long without air. Blue came through the gate and lay down with his head on my boot. The old dog had heard me mutter all kinds of nonsense that fall, but this was the first sentence that felt true all the way through. The mare in that winter barn, the owner's face at the gate, the weeks of replaying every second until I turned hesitation into identity. It all came up at once, not as pictures this time, but as weight. I put both hands over my eyes and breathed through my fingers. My shoulders shook. I didn't try to stop it. I cried there in the straw with a wild doe 3 feet away and an old cattle dog as witness, and I cried like a man who had spent too long holding still so nothing worse would happen. It wasn't neat. It wasn't dignified. It was relief and grief and shame unhooking from each other enough that I could tell them apart. I heard myself talking in low, broken pieces, the way people do when they've run out of polished stories. I didn't freeze because I didn't care. I froze because I cared and got afraid of being wrong. Then I stayed afraid. Then I called it caution so it would sound respectable. The doe chewed once and blinked at me like I was just weather passing through. Blue thumped his tail against the straw, slow and patient. By the time I wiped my face on my sleeve, the lantern had burned lower and the wind had gone softer on the roof tin. I stood, stretched my back, and topped off the doe's water. Then I did one more thing I hadn't planned. I went to the workbench, took the little birch bundle wrapping he'd left on the fence, and laid it open. The yarrow inside had bruised purple-green where I'd used some on the scuff earlier, but there was enough left for a fresh poultice. I ground it with warm water and a pinch of clean clay from my kit, spread it thin where tissue looked irritated above the wrap line, and secured it gentle. The smell rose sharp and clean, green against all the barn smells of hay and old leather. The doe lowered her head and settled deeper. An hour later, the moon had shifted off the yard and the timber line was mostly shadow. I stepped outside to cool my face, and Blue came with me. We stood at the west side where the ground sloped towards the lodge poles, and at first, all I saw was black trunks and silver frost beginning on the grass. Then a shape stood just beyond the first line of trees, not hidden, not advancing. Tall enough that I had to tip my head to take in his full outline between branches. He stayed there, still as a stump, and somehow more present than anything moving. I didn't go closer. I didn't have to. I put my hands where he could see them, and spoke in the same tone I used on frightened stock, low and plain. She's stable now. Panels holding. I used what you left. He tilted his head once, slight as a bird adjusting on a wire. I drew a breath that felt cold all the way to my ribs. I need to say this where it counts. I thought my instincts were gone. I thought one bad night meant I was finished. You keep showing up and doing the next kind thing like it's just work to be done. I forgot that part. I forgot that care can be simple. Blue sat, tail sweeping once over frosted grass, and watched him with that easy attention he reserved for trusted company. I heard my own voice go thin again and didn't fight it. Thank you for not giving up on her. And thank you for not giving up on me before I figured myself out. He didn't move for several breaths. No display, no theatrical pause, just a steady regard that held me in place better than any command. Then he lowered one arm and opened his hand toward the ground between us. Something pale flashed at his fingers. He placed it down, straightened, and took 2 backward steps, never turning his back, giving distance the way polite men do on narrow trails. I waited until he was still again, then walked forward 12 paces and stopped where he had set the object. It was a strip of peeled willow cambium folded around fresh cedar tips, tied with grass, in the same even braid pattern as the splint. Not medicine this time. Kindling, dry at the core, prepared to catch a spark in wet weather. Practical mercy again. My laugh came out wet and shaky. You plan ahead better than most people I know, I said. He stood in shadow with the moon catching only the edges of his shoulders. Blue stood too, ears forward, then looked back at me as if to ask whether I understood what was being offered. I did. It wasn't proof. It wasn't ownership. It was partnership in small tasks. I crouched, set the willow bundle under my arm, and from my jacket pocket took the pocket knife I'd carried since my father's funeral. The blade was worn thin from years of sharpening. I walked to the fence post, carved one clean notch into the top rail, then stepped back so he could see it. A marker, a thank you, a place where work had held. He watched the notch, then looked at me, and I felt that same calm pressure I'd felt in the meadow when I first found the splinted doe. Not threat, not demand, simply an invitation to keep choosing steadiness. The wind shifted downslope with the smell of creek water and fir pitch. Somewhere far off, a pair of coyotes traded calls, and then fell quiet again. He turned his shoulders toward the deeper timber, paused once as if listening to the night itself, and began to walk. Each step was careful, heel to toe, weight placed around saplings and deadfall instead of through them. By the time he reached the second line of trees, he was already mostly shadow. He did not look back this time. He didn't need to. In 3 more strides, the forest took him completely, and all that remained was the faint sway of fern tops settling where he had passed. No ceremony, no final sign, just absence returning to its proper place. I stayed at the fence until the cold worked through my jacket and made my fingers stiff. Blue pressed his shoulder to my knee and then nosed the willow bundle under my hand, like he was reminding me to bring it in. We walked back to the barn together. I hung the bundle above the stove to dry, wrote the time in my notebook and added 1 line under it without dressing it up. He left when the work was done. By dawn, the frost had silvered every rail on the property, and thin sun came through low cloud in pale sheets that made the wet pasture shine. I carried coffee to the pen, checked the doe, and found her already up on 3 good legs, and the splinted one touching down lightly, cautious, but willing. I changed her wrap with steady hands. No tremor, no second-guessing spiral. Just assessment, adjustment, recheck. After chores, I texted Mara that the microscope was boxed and ready. A minute later, Ben replied from her phone, "Can I still come if it snows?" I looked out at the bright frost and the west timber beyond it, and for the first time in a long while, my answer came without hesitation. "Road's rough but passable. I'll be here." Ben showed up Saturday just after noon in Mara's old SUV. Knit cap pulled low, microscope case hugged to his chest before he even shut the passenger door. I met him at the porch with the box of slides in my hands and felt that old awkwardness between us, the one that comes when 2 people love each other and don't yet trust the weather. He looked taller than the last time, all elbows and intent, and Blue shoved past my knee to inspect his boots like a customs officer. "Road was sketchy by the bridge," Ben said. "I salted the bend before daylight," I said. "You hungry?" He nodded. "Can I see the deer first?" That landed so clean in me I had to look past him at the ridge for a second. "Yeah," I said. "Let's go slow. She startles if we crowd her." In the barn, he moved exactly where I asked. Quiet feet, hands in his pockets, eyes taking in the splint, the reinforced panel, the deep bedding. He noticed the shelf before I pointed it out, the trimmed grass braid in a jar, pressed yarrow stems in wax paper, 1 crossed creek stone and twig, and the old trail cam card case with dates, written in marker. He did not laugh. He did not give me the polite kid nod adults get when they sound strange. He just stood there and said, "You kept it like evidence." "Like a chart," I said. Like I didn't want to lie to myself later. He crouched beside the gate and watched the doe shift her weight onto the splintered foreleg, careful and willing. "You did good work," he said, then glanced up. "So did whoever started it." The sky went hard white by late afternoon, that flat winter light that swallows distance. Mara texted at 4 asking if I wanted to send Ben back before the front hit. I stepped out by the woodpile to call her, wind already needling through my jacket. "If he stays," she said, "I need a straight answer about conditions." "Straight answer is we're safer staying put tonight," I said. "Creek's rising, but pen's above the first line. I've got fuel, food, and backup heat." She was quiet a beat. "He wants to stay." I looked through the mudroom window where Ben was teaching Blue to sit, like a scientist, beside the microscope case. "I want him to stay too," I said. "All right," she said. "Text every couple hours. Don't go silent on me." "I won't." By dusk, the widow freeze came down the draw like a slammed door. Snow first, then sleet, then that glassy rain that turns ruts into blades. Alder Creek changed pitch around 7, from steady push to a louder, broken rush that made the yard feel smaller. Ben and I pulled on headlamps and checked the pen line every 40 minutes, moving in pairs, calling out footing and wire gaps like a 2-man clinic crew. At 9, we saw water licking the lower pasture fence where it never reached this early. At 10, a dead cottonwood section broke loose upstream and slammed the bank below the wildlife pen, redirecting current straight toward the lean-to corner. "Dad," Ben said, voice tight, "it's cutting under." "I see it." I grabbed the emergency sled and a spool of rope, then lost my footing on black ice and sent the sled skidding downslope into the dark. I swore once, breathless, then caught myself because Ben was watching my face for cues. "We'll get it," I said, though I had no clear path for 10 seconds that felt like 10 minutes. Then the beam of my headlamp hit movement in the storm wash, huge, dark, deliberate. He came out of the sleet below us, braced knee-deep in current at the edge of the cut bank, both hands on a length of deadfall that would have taken me and Roy and a chain to budge. He rolled it into place across the new channel, then set a second trunk against it, curved, creating a rough diversion wall that caught debris and kicked the flow back toward the original creek line. Not magic. Hydrology and strength and timing. Ben made a sound halfway between gasp and laugh. "Dad." "I know," I said, and my voice shook anyway. The sled I'd dropped had lodged against willow roots. He waded to it, lifted it by one strap like it weighed nothing, and carried it upslope. At the pen he stopped 3 yards out and lowered it near my boots, then stepped back so I could take over. Space given. Work handed off. The same language as always. "We need dry starter," I said aloud, more to keep my mind organized than to request the impossible in sleet. He turned once toward the lean-to, reached under the overhang where shadow stayed dry, and set down a bundle of bark curls and split kindling wrapped in willow cambium. The same kind he'd left before, larger now, dry at the core. Practical mercy again. Ben knelt beside the dough while I got flame under the storm hood, then heat bricks wrapped and tucked along the sheltered wall. Water kept hammering the diversion, but the line at the pen stopped rising. 15 minutes later, it had dropped 2 inches from the highest mark on the post. When the immediate danger eased, the release hit me so hard I had to sit in wet straw. I took my gloves off and pressed both hands to my face, breathing steam through my fingers. Ben sat beside me without touching, just close enough to be there. The big figure stood at the tree line beyond the yard light, sleet silvering his shoulders, watching us and not intruding. "I need to tell you something," I said to Ben, staring at the pen gate because looking at him felt harder. I was scared to touch anything that needed me. After that mare, I got scared and called it caution and hid in work. He was quiet long enough for creek noise to fill the gap. Then he said, simple and steady, "You touched this." I looked at him then. 12 years old, soaked through, jaw set like Mara's when she's done pretending. He nodded toward the dough, the braces, the fire. Blue curled against the gate, and finally toward the dark shape at the trees. "You kept touching it," he said, "even when you were scared." I cried in front of him, no way around it, tears hot and useless in freezing rain, and he leaned his shoulder into mine like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. When I looked back to the tree line, amber-brown eyes held us for one more breath. Then he turned and walked into clearing mist, unhurried, and the woods closed behind him. Dawn came pale and windless. The floodline had broken away from the pen and chewed a new channel through sedge, but the diversion wall held enough to save the corner posts. Ben and I walked the damage in rubber boots, marking repairs on a feed tag with a carpenter pencil. At the stump by the west fence, we found one clean willow strip braided into a loop and set around a smooth stone. Ben picked it up carefully. "Gift?" he asked. "Looks like one." He thought about that. "Can we keep this one?" "Yeah," I said. "This one stays." 3 days later, when roads reopened, I loaded the tagged rusted snare into the truck and took it to county hazardous disposal, signed the form, and watched it go into the metal bin. From there, I drove to the clinic back door and picked up my books and framed licenses from the office manager, Janice, who hugged me once and pretended she hadn't. Darren caught me in the hall with X-rays in his hand. "You still dodging consults?" he asked. I looked at the films, then at my own name on the license frame under my arm. "Not today," I said. "What have you got?" By the second week of March, Thor had softened the lower meadow and the doe was bearing weight with a mild hitch, but no pain response on palpation. Ben was there that Saturday, muddy to his knees and talking non-stop about a science fair project on fracture healing in wild ungulates. Roy came by with fence staples and stood at the rail watching the doe test her leg. He gave me that old flat look, then said, "My grandfather used to say there was a tall one in these foothills that minded stock better than people did. I thought he was seasoning stories." He scratched Blue behind the ear. "Maybe he wasn't." "You ever see him?" I asked. Roy shook his head. "No, just tracks once, years back after a late storm. I never told it because I didn't need town idiots at my gate." That resolved the look he'd been giving me since the feed store, and it felt like a quiet gift, too. We opened the pen gate at noon. The doe stood still, ears working, then stepped out, one careful pace, then another, and crossed into the meadow without bolting. She paused at the willow break, looked back once at us lined along the fence, me, Ben, Roy, Blue, and then moved into the timber on a clean, steady line. That evening, I went through every item on the shelf and chose what to do with each. The grass braid, pressed yarrow and willow loop around the stone went into a cedar box, Ben labelled in block letters. Alder Creek case, private. The crossed stone and twig. I returned to the west fence rail, the birch wrapping and spent kindling fibres I burned in the stove, with a quiet thank you. The trail cam cards I copied to 2 drives. One stayed with me, one I gave Ben for his project archive. The track photos and measurements I printed and filed, then decided not to submit anywhere. Not abandoned exactly, kept in trust. In April, I rehung my shingle as a small mixed practice route. No grand reopening, just calls taken and miles driven. First week back, I treated Roy's heifer, a ranch dog with a torn pad, and 2 alpacas that hated me on principle. I still felt fear sometimes on urgent calls, but it no longer ran the room. It sat in the truck with me and I drove anyway. Ben came most weekends after that. We fixed the porch pitch, rebuilt the microscope station in the mudroom, and argued cheerfully about whether Blue understood English or just tone. On clear evenings, we walked to the west fence and stood without talking much. We never forced a sighting. We didn't need one. The original bark splint hangs above my workbench now, cleaned and wired to a pine backboard beside my father's old hoof rasp. When clients ask, I tell them it's a reminder about alignment under pressure. That's true. The fuller truth is private and simple. Big strength can be quiet. Care can arrive from beyond my framework. And a reluctant believer can still believe enough to heal.